You know, I do like an oddball aircraft. I especially like the ones that are really unique, and particularly float planes. And this aircraft, the Edo OSE or XOSE, definitely ticks all those boxes. A rather handsome little aircraft, in my opinion, with rather fighter-esque lines. You may be thinking, Edo? Who are they? I have never heard of their aircraft before. Which would be fair enough because the Edo Aircraft Corporation didn't really make aircraft, or not many of them anyway. They made pontoons for float planes, and those you probably have seen, though you may not have known it, because Edo floats were arguably the best in the world in their day and were commonly fitted to many US Navy aircraft, which meant Edo was pretty busy in the run-up to World War II. During the Second World War, and indeed in the decades before it, float planes fulfilled an absolutely critical role in the battle fleets of the day. They provided long-range reconnaissance, artillery spotting for naval gunfire, and even provided search and rescue and anti-submarine services for the battleships and cruisers they served upon. For the US Navy, float planes had long been one of the key aircraft they operated, the importance of which may have been obscured by the rise of carrier-based air power, but one that was always recognised by the service as being critical to their requirements. Indeed, they even maintained their own factory, largely to make sure they always had a source of supply of float planes. When the United States entered the war in 1941, the Navy had several types in operation, principally the Vought OS-2U Kingfisher and the Curtiss Seagull. These both provided sterling use, but obviously with the pace of technical innovations, the US Navy wasn't going to sit around and had a successor in the pipeline, the Curtiss Sea-Mew, which turned out to be pretty terrible once it got into service in 1942. The US Navy therefore instituted a fresh request for a new float plane, which would provide better performance than the rather useless Sea-Mew, and the older aircraft that were continuing to soldier on, and this eventually resulted in the Curtiss SC Seahawk. But there was another contender, the aforementioned OSE. As said, this was a bit of a dark horse option because Edo built floats, not aircraft, and the information available on the aircraft is rather imprecise and sometimes contradictory, so I shall do my best to summarise the different accounts on the history of this aircraft. With the failure of the Sea-Mew and the urgent need for a replacement, either the US Navy approached Edo about having a crack at building them a new fleet float plane, or else Edo, sensing an opportunity, made the pitch themselves. I'll be honest, I don't know which is true, but as Curtiss were the main contender for the new aircraft, even though they had already screwed up the Sea-Mew, it would seem to make sense that the Navy may have wanted a backup option and so authorised Edo to proceed. Plus, this was at the height of World War II. Every US aircraft manufacturer was already producing at capacity. So, having a company that didn't make aircraft but did have some measure of aeronautic experience and therefore could, theoretically, have spare capacity for building niche aircraft needed in comparatively small numbers, and therefore take the burden off the main aircraft builders, also makes some sense too. Another factor to consider is the timeline of the Edo ESO. While it is often stated that the ESO was a competitor to the Curtiss Seahawk, the Edo aircraft didn't apparently begin development until January 1944. By this point, the Seahawk was just about to start its own flight testing and would enter service later that year. So again, an argument for building a backup design to the Seahawk, especially when you note the fact that the new Curtiss aircraft was surprisingly heavy. In fact, it was about 30% heavier than the Sea-Mew and about twice that of the Vought Kingfisher. Considering that these were aircraft that needed to be craned out of the water by their motherships after flight and added top weight to vessels that were already being overstressed by accumulations of additional equipment, most notably vast numbers of anti-aircraft guns that often weren't accounted for in their initial designs, well, every additional ton added had to be carefully thought through. I'll admit I haven't found any documentary evidence to back up this theory, but it makes sense, especially when you realise that the OSE's weight was much closer to the older Kingfisher than the newer Curtiss aircraft. Whatever the reasons, Edo were given the green light to proceed and build a limited run of prototypes for testing and evaluation. Initially designated as the XS2E, the XOSE was a pretty nifty looking machine. Built entirely from metal, the aircraft was created in single and two-seat configurations, with the latter being converted from single-seaters for the testing program. Float configuration was the same as standard with US aircraft of the type, with a large central and two wing floats, all built in aluminium, which was practically the Edo trademark. On top of that, the aircraft was also designed to allow the floats to be detached and a fixed wheel undercarriage to be fitted to allow shore-based operations. Naturally, as befits a shipboard aircraft, the OSE could fold down into a compact package for stowage aboard when not in use. Powerplant was a Ranger 770-8, an inverted V12 engine that produced 520 horsepower. The Ranger was a bit of an unusual choice, as it was used in the aforementioned Curtiss Seamew and had a number of issues that don't ever seem to have been fully resolved. And indeed, problems with the engines, particularly with their cooling, would be notable in the OSE's test flights. My best guess on this choice is that the Navy had lots of them and hoped that the engine, which did offer a lot of power in a very small package, would eventually have the problems resolved. There are also some sources that state that the original intention was to fit an auxiliary jet engine to the aircraft, but I haven't been able to confirm that. Certainly by the time that testing began, that idea had been dropped. Armament consisted of two 50 caliber Browning heavy machine guns in the wings, plus the ability to carry two depth charges or auxiliary drop tanks. Additionally, two hardpoints could also carry droppable air-sea rescue sets, and another was designed to allow the carriage of a surface search radar. I mean, on paper certainly, the OSE had a lot going for it as a multi-purpose ship-based floatplane. With a top speed of 188 miles per hour and a range of 600 miles, it combined lightweight and compact design with a lot more firepower and capabilities than its predecessors. But it was also rather late to the party. First flight of the single-seater occurred in December 1945, while the first of the two-seaters got into the air in 1947. Obviously, this was after the war had ended, and this meant, along with the fact that the new Curtiss Seahawk was doing the job satisfactorily, their funding was cut and development slowed right down. It was to become increasingly apparent that the day of the shipborne floatplane was essentially over, and their job would be taken up by the new helicopters that were coming into service and more advanced carrier-based aircraft. Of the 10 XOSEs of all types built, none now remain, and it is now very much a rather elegant looking, but still forgotten, aircraft.